Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming today. I am Steve Swayne, and I serve Dartmouth College as the Jacob H. Strauss 1922 Professor of Music and as the Interim Director of the Montgomery Fellows Program. Given my interim status as Montgomery Director, I trust you will excuse me for not wearing the Montgomery tartan today. I warmly welcome you to the first public event of the Montgomery Fellows Program in this calendar year. The Kenneth and Harl Montgomery Endowment at Dartmouth was established in 1977 to foster the advancement of the academic realm of the college in ways that will significantly add to the quality and character of the institution. In extending and enriching the college's curriculum, the endowment's mission is to bring outstanding luminaries from the academic world as well as from non-academic spheres to campus. Our interlocutors today straddle these multiverses and more. This term's Montgomery Fellow is Jake Sullivan. Jake is a renowned American policymaker and analyst for international affairs. He served as National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, and prior to that as Director of Policy Planning at the State Department under Secretary Hillary Clinton, a job he took at the age of 34. During the most recent presidential election, Jake was Clinton's top foreign policy advisor. He has additionally partnered with, among others, Amy Klobuchar, Beto O'Rourke, and Barack Obama. He has stories to tell, knows where bodies are buried, and has visions of democracy present and future that are at turns exhilarating and exhausting. I leave it to his conversation companion this afternoon to tease out some of these intricacies. Dan Benjamin serves Dartmouth as the Norman E. McCullough Jr. Director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. Dan has also trafficked in the same corridors and with some of the same people as Jake, having served this country as Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the U.S. State Department. Sitting alongside these two men last week in Pine as they discussed the similarities and differences between Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, that's not something you hear about every day in Hanover. So, without further ado, will you join me in welcoming Jake and Dan to take the stage?
Well, thank you very much. And Steve, thank you for that terrific introduction. I'm going to go home and practice my elocution at great length because that was fabulous. And congratulations on being Montgomery Director. I really want to thank Jake Sullivan for joining us here. It is absolutely great news for Dickey, for Dartmouth, for Montgomery, and for all of us concerned that he is here for the term, and it's not a secret, I think, that we're hoping to hold on to him. Next term is a distinguished fellow at the Dickey Center and on into the future. To have one of the foremost foreign policy thinkers and makers, policy makers of the day join Dartmouth is really an incredible windfall for all of us, and we're absolutely delighted you're here. And it is a great man who does his inaugural event at Dartmouth in a snow squall. So all I can say is I'm thrilled. And one of the highlights of my time in government was getting to work with Jake. So to be reunited up here in God's country is just absolutely wonderful. So let's go right to it. By the way, anecdotal information suggests that the community has found out that you're here and that you're already scheduling lunches into 2022. Can you confirm or deny that?
I've discovered the local haunts.
Yes, okay. Yeah. Well, you'll probably be approached for endorsements soon, so do that with care.
Right.
But anyway, I thought that what we would do is talk a bit about the world, and then talk a bit about our own country and its politics, and then open it up for a long question and answer period. So I think it's probably not going too far out on a limb to say that you, like me, are not a huge fan of the current administration's foreign policy. And so I thought we'd start out by doing a little tour d'horizon. And I thought maybe we'd start with Europe, which is where we always look for, I think, our reflection and our reflection in the world, really. And you spend a good amount of time meeting with foreign leaders and prominent foreign policy analysts, journalists, and the like. And I was wondering if we could start off with a description of the state of U.S.-European relations today.
Sure. First of all, I just say thanks to Steve and the Montgomery Fellows Program and Dan and the Dickey Center and the opportunity to be here at Dartmouth and in Hanover. You know you're in Hanover when they give you a box of Kleenex on your chair when you're coming to a public event. So I'm grateful for that. I will treasure it and take it home with me. And surely use it over the next few weeks.
It's just like the presidential M&Ms we used to get at the mess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's interesting. I guess I would start by saying that I've been struck by the fact that Donald Trump really doesn't like his European counterparts, and he makes that plain. And I struggled for a while to figure out why that was the case. And I finally decided that at least part of it is that he looks at European small d Democrats, democratically elected leaders, and sees American big D Democrats, these kind of annoying people who whine at him about things like climate change and refugees and other progressive causes. And he sees people like Theresa May and Angela Merkel and thinks, that's Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi. I don't like these people. I like Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin and Erdogan and Mohammed el-Sisi and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. He's just fundamentally uncomfortable with the notion that there is some kind of transatlantic community, not just of common interests, but of common values. And as a result, forces that I think were already somewhat at work, making the Europeans question the degree to which they could continue to rely on the United States long into the future, have been accelerated. And you have people like Angela Merkel publicly musing about whether they can count on the United States indefinitely. And I would sort of divide, in the conversations I've had with European leaders over the last 2 years, divide that conversation into two halves. One half basically says, we're going to just duck for the next 4 years, and then poof, Donald Trump will go away and we can get back to business as usual or something close to it. And the other half that basically says, no, this is not an aberration, this is the ushering in of a new normal. And the longer this goes on, and the more acute the ways in which there are strains on the US-European relationship, including a New York Times article yesterday which said that Trump is very seriously considering pulling out of NATO, the more I think that second camp is going to start to prevail. And then the question for both Europeans and Americans and the world at large is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it a good thing if the Europeans decide that a 70-year bargain should be readjusted to a certain extent to meet the new world? And I can see arguments for why that would be so. The world today is different than the Cold War. It's different than the immediate post-Cold War period. But I fundamentally believe that if we end up with the United States and Europe having a basic cleavage, it will come at a great cost to both of us, because there are forces gathering in the world that have a very different view of how societies should organize themselves, that have a fundamentally illiberal view of questions around democracy, human rights, and the like, and that the US and Europe need to stand together more than ever now. But we do need to do it in a way that doesn't just go back to the way things were before, but that refreshes things for the future. I have to say, though, that I'm quite nervous about where this is all going to go. And the last thing I would say is this is happening at a moment where where Europe is feeling immense pressure from its east, from Russia, from its south, from a refugee crisis that will only accelerate and not abate, and then from its west with Brexit. And we just saw this week how confounding that issue has become. So even without Donald Trump, the pressures and stresses on the European project have been profound. When you add Trump to the mix and real questions about the future of the transatlantic relationship, I think we all have to basically say that what was once known as the free world is in a state of pretty severe crisis, and our job has to be to think about how we step up to address that crisis and find a way forward that is not merely nostalgic, not merely backward-looking, but is forward-looking in some way.
So you anticipated my next question, because Merkel has said, looking across the Atlantic, that to Germany and to Europe, that we now have to reckon with the fact that the United States is unstable. I mean, that's basically what she said, that we are, because of our politics, incapable of being the America of the past. And it seems to me that part of what we as Americans often forget when we hear things like that is that for Europeans, the re-election of George W. Bush was the start of this trend as far as they were concerned, because they looked at Iraq and they saw a disaster, and a disaster that has continued to be the gift that keeps on giving, with all kinds of follow-on consequences for the region. And then they're saying, well, what is it in the American, what's in the water over there? I'd be curious if you get a lot of that when you talk to them. Or sometimes when I talk to Europeans, they're like, oh, well, you'll get through it. But then there are others who are saying, no,
right.
This has changed.
It's interesting. If you work in U.S. foreign policy, you tend to have a view that the U.S. is the constant and everything else out there in the world is the variable. And those variables have to be managed. And now the largest variable of all in global politics is the United States of America. And that will not simply end if Donald Trump walks out of the White House and is no longer the president, because even if you get a president coming after who's something of a restorationist, who says we got to get back to some fundamental principles around allies, around values, around a set of rules, around the kind of rules-based order for the world, you're still going to have an undercurrent in the United States that is going to press against that pretty hard. And there's no telling that you don't get Trump 2.0 4 years, 8 years, 12 years from now. So the variable quality of this is going to continue. And anyone who works on foreign policy in the United States or in the rest of the world is going to have to account for that. That's, in a way, the bad news. But I don't want this to be purely a story of pessimism. My last name is Sullivan. I'm Irish. William Butler Yeats said of Irish people that they have an abiding sense of tragedy which sustains them through temporary periods of joy. And that is usually my approach. But I want to give you a slightly more optimistic view of this based on two observations. The first is that I was with Hillary Clinton when she made her first appearance in NATO after 8 years of the Bush administration, shortly after Barack Obama was elected. And when she arrived at NATO headquarters, the collected diplomats had all come out front basically to greet her with a rousing cheer, basically to say, a fellow traveler is in power and America's back, and we're really excited about that. Now, you do that, you go through that swing a second time post-Trump. I don't think you're going to get the exact same reaction because people are getting a little tired of the act with the United States, but I believe there is a deep reservoir of goodwill for the United States in Europe and in the rest of the world. A second example around this is that when the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the other 11 countries went forward with the deal and did so with a minimum amount of variance from what the US had originally negotiated, because if you talk to people in Singapore or in Japan, or even in Vietnam, they will say, we are hoping that America will plug back into this thing come 2021. We want the United States back. So the demand signal, in my view, is out there. That's one positive. The second is that I actually think there are models out there for how the United States can contribute in positive ways to solving global problems that can account for political volatility in America. And I'll use the Paris Climate Agreement as an example of that. So Trump has announced that the United States has pulled out of Paris, and yet the deal will continue with the rest of the world continuing to make their commitments, and the United States will make meaningful contributions to it because a huge amount of the locus of decision-making around energy and climate policy in the United States is at the state and city level. So it's Mike Bloomberg and Jerry Brown who are now showing up at Paris climate meetings, not the President of the United States. But the design of that agreement, the fact that it has flexibility and adaptability, is such that it can actually withstand the temporary departure of the United States. Now, it can't withstand the permanent departure of the United States, But it's built capaciously and effectively enough to be able to take that on and then get to an escalating level of ambition as we go forward so that it can actually meet the scope of the challenge that we face. So, I could easily spell out the doomsday case for where American foreign policy is headed, given political division in America. But I do think that there are some green shoots that can be seized upon to manage for a more effective way of approaching foreign policy and world problems, even in the face of political turmoil here in the United States.
Well, then we'll have to get a little more challenging. Moving a little to the east, Russia. So we have a bizarrely bifurcated relationship with Russia. We have a president who has his own relationship with Russia. We have an executive branch and a Congress which have probably not been as hostile towards Russia, certainly since the Cold War and probably since considerably earlier in the Cold War. And for many Americans, the intervention, the Russian meddling in the election was an act that will probably stand in their view, and we can debate whether it's true, and I'm sure our friend Philip Short will be happy to debate it. As an act that was the gravest violation of our sovereignty, certainly since 9/11. And what does any president do, any next president do, when they come into office? I have a hard time imagining this relationship getting rationalized between now and 2020, but let's assume that you are, national security advisor for President whomever. I won't predetermine that one. What do you do about a relationship with a country that is profoundly damaged, and yet at the same time, because of their nuclear arsenal and our nuclear arsenal, we can't allow to continue to deteriorate?
One of the, I had lunch with Philip today, and we talked a lot about Vladimir Putin and about the U.S.-Russia relationship. And I believe the fundamental job of the next president of the United States is to find a way to put a floor under this relationship so that it does not completely collapse and that we don't revert to the type of confrontation that could easily lead to escalation that could ultimately lead to the unthinkable, which is war between two nuclear powers. An astonishing fact, a few months ago in Syria, a group of Russian mercenaries with a pretty tight nexus to Russian command and control approached a U.S. base in Syria, and the U.S. determined they represented a threat, and they launched defensive measures and killed several hundred of them, 200 to 300 of them. That is more Russians killed in hostile acts by the United States than in the entirety of the Cold War. And it happened, and it was out of the news in like 24 hours. Largely because both sides had an interest in tamping this down and not escalating it. But it goes to show you that with our forces continuing to operate in close quarters in places and our interests as at odds as they are, and then moves like pulling out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty could contribute to a sense of strategic instability. We have to get a floor under this that basically sets the terms for a stable relationship, and then we can deal with clear eyes and conviction with some of our deep objections, including on issues like Russian intervention. I believe there's a kind of strain of thinking which says this is really all America's fault. It was NATO expansion, and you Americans provoked Russia with Ukraine. I don't buy that line of reasoning, but I'm happy to debate people on it. I do think a major contributor to the difficulty of putting a floor under the relationship or defining stable and mature terms is that it is hard to talk to Vladimir Putin in a way where you can get a common vision of what is actually happening in the world. So, and I don't mean like a vision from the perspective of ideology or argumentation. I mean just like basic facts. So when I was working for President Obama and Russian irregular forces invaded eastern Ukraine, he would get on the phone with President Putin and say, Vladimir, I want to find an exit ramp for this. I want to find a way out to resolve the issue of Russian forces in Ukraine. And Putin would say, there are no Russian forces in Ukraine. There are none. And Obama would say, I'm looking at photographs of the tanks, and I'll send you the numbers on the shoulders of the guys. And No, it's not true. I don't know how you either deter a country or de-escalate and create diplomacy with the country when you can't even get some common basis in fact like that. And there is a kind of Mars-Venus quality between the way that Russians approach these problems and the way Americans approach these problems. We have this kind of gee whiz, let's all sit down and just go through our checklist. And they want to work through much deeper structural grievances, and we need to solve for that. But fundamentally, it's going to take two to tango on this. And I have my doubts about whether at this point, given all the water under the bridge, that there will be an easy way to sit down with Putin and have a serious conversation about the parameters of a relationship that can put curbs on the worst of their behavior and curbs on some of their objections to ours. So I'm quite pessimistic about where the U.S.-Russia relationship is going to go, even if I believe the project should be one that is in the interests of both of our countries.
Just to clarify what I said a minute ago, Philip Short, who's sitting with us here tonight, is the Magro Family Distinguished Fellow at the Dickey Center right now and is writing a biography of Putin and has been a great interlocutor for many of us during his residency. And I encourage you to buttonhole him and talk to him about this issue and turn him around a little.
By the way, I showed Philip a side-by-side photo my wife took of me and a photo of Vladimir Putin when he was about my age as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and it is a little scary, actually. Yeah. So if I come back in like 15 years as a, I guess barefoot on horseback, don't be alarmed.
Well, there are a lot of AK-47s around here if you want to do the picture of that too. So I just want to drill down on this a little though, because we can imagine, in fact, I think we can predict fairly confidently that the Russians are going to intervene in the next election as well. You never know which side they're going to intervene on because it seems like their principal aim is chaos rather than a particular outcome. But whoever is inaugurated on January 20th of 2021 will have an issue on his or her hands, and the question then becomes, what does a diplomat do first? Call up and say we need to have a summit to talk about all these issues? Would that be it? Or punitive acts? It's kind of hypothetical, absent a more concrete set of facts.
It's a great question. I mean, in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia in August. Obama gets elected in November, and the reset is fast underway in January. And the question is,
we do that again.
Was that the right reckoning? Now, resets have been a common feature of American presidents when it comes to Russia, pretty much across the board. It's always the new guy comes in. Hopefully, at some point, it'll be the new gal comes in and says, oh, well, I don't know why these other people couldn't figure it out. Let me take a shot at it. And that tends to work for a little while and then deteriorates. I guess my view on this is at some point, we've got to get to a structured conversation where rather than move aggressively first and just create further grievances, we say this is door number one and this is door number two for our relationship. And door number two is going to involve the U.S. applying a series of coercive measures, including on the economic front. But door number one would be some way for us to come to an understanding about what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. The problem with having that conversation is that I think the U.S. foreign policy apparatus is set up to do it, to have trusted interlocutors do it. But it's my sense that the only guy who can really effectively have that on the Russian side is Putin himself. And he's not going to sit around for days engaged in this kind of interchange. So that creates a real conundrum for a policymaker. How do you sequence showing that you're serious and you are going to impose costs for the kinds of behavior that Russia's engaged in, but at the same time not make those costs a self-fulfilling prophecy for a continued downward spiral? And as I sit here today, I don't have a good answer for you about how you calibrate that recipe because there's not a mechanical or mathematical formula for it. You somehow have to balance demonstrating resolve while at the same time opening the door to saying maybe we can find a better way forward. And I hope that's what the next president does. And in fact, it will be something of a surprise to Putin if the next president came along and said, let's see if we can work it out, because I anticipate that over the next 2 years, all of the Democrats are going to be pretty damn harsh in their rhetoric about Russia and Putin, for good reason. But there's a difference between campaigning and holding a guy like Donald Trump accountable and then actually sitting in the chair and trying to figure out how do we manage a relationship with the great superpowers so that, frankly, we can take some of the bandwidth that's being invested in that and turn it to other really significant challenges in the world today.
Okay. So moving right along, there's a little game that's going on among foreign policy types these days when they get on the phone. You try to see who can be the first one to say to the other, so do you know what our Syria policy is today?
Right.
It's kind of horrifying. We really have a total lack of clarity in a way that it's hard to think of an analog in recent history. Setting aside the issue of Syria itself and its tragedy, though, what do you think are the costs for us in the region of having all of this ambiguity? And to carry it out a little further, we're talking about devastating Turkey now, a NATO ally, admittedly a particularly challenging one. Where does it end, and how do we get back to having a sensible policy in the region?
There was a lot of talk in the early months of the Trump administration about Richard Nixon's madman theory, which is having an unpredictable president is a good thing because it destabilizes your negotiating partners, your adversaries, and puts you in a better position to apply leverage and extract concessions. The madman theory does not work if you have the functional equivalent of a madman actually executing it. The person's got to be genuinely with it and just be playing at this, as opposed to, then it's no longer the madman theory, it's just the madman practice of international relations. Now, I'm not saying Trump's crazy, but I'm saying that unpredictability is not the execution of a strategy. Unpredictability is just a feature of his personality when it comes to foreign policy. And I think that is a problem in this case, because what it is effectively doing is undermining our relationships with friends and emboldening our enemies in ways that I think will ultimately be adverse to U.S. interests. And I divide this from the core question of whether it is a good or bad thing to keep American troops in Syria. I think it is a totally credible case for someone to say, we should not be there indefinitely, we are going to have to draw down, let's execute a strategy to get that done. I don't have a problem with that. But it can't be precipitous, and it has to take account of the tremendous sacrifices that the Kurds made at our request to deal with a threat that we thought was paramount, the existence of the Islamic State. And it has to be done in a way where we send clear messages to our allies and partners in the region of what we're trying to accomplish through that drawdown. And we've done exactly the opposite in every respect. And the result of it is that the Kurds now are scrambling to cut a deal with Moscow because they don't think the U.S. can help them anymore, where alternatively we are handing the Kurds over to the Turks, or we're going to attack the Turks, where the Iranians and Russians are sort of chortling at what is effectively American incompetence, and where everybody else is looking at this and just thinking, we have no sense of how the application of American leverage or influence can produce a more positive outcome. So I think this is
And the upside is?
There's no upside. This is what is happening right now with all the different voices and all the different ways of going at this is just terrible. If you wanted one upside, here's one possible one, which is a complete, this is complete speculation on my part, but something to consider is the fact that Trump has been undercutting Bolton so publicly in the back and forth. The Iranians may be watching that and saying, maybe Trump doesn't intend to take military action against us because Bolton has been out there suggesting that, and actually asking the Pentagon to order up options on this issue. So it is possible. There's a possibility that all this insanity somehow contributes to an amelioration of tensions between the U.S. and Iran. That would be a good thing. But that's me just looking kind of frantically around for something positive to say about what I think is a genuinely problematic thing. And here's the deal. There is a knee-jerk kind of quality to the commentary about Donald Trump's foreign policy, particularly among Democrats, particularly among people like me who work to not have him be sitting where he's sitting. And I do think that I and others like me have to check ourselves and not fall into the rule that if Donald Trump has done it, it must just by definition be bad. And when you come to an issue like drawing down US forces in Syria or in Afghanistan. I think a lot of people on the progressive side would say, generally speaking, that's a good thing. And so we have to divide the underlying substance of the issue from the method of execution and the reasons for execution, why things are happening. You know, is it for some sensible, reflective reason, or is it just the whims of somebody? But we should be very disciplined in how we divide between those two things, lest we just fall into a kind of call and response thing that's completely unprofitable to everybody.
I don't know what I'm going to be doing for the next few weeks. Now that you've said that, I feel like I've had the rug pulled out from under me. I'm just curious, have you talked to any Israelis in the aftermath of the announcement of the pullout from Syria and the remark that the Iranians can do whatever they want in Syria? I would have thought that that would be deeply disturbing to them.
So I haven't, but I will tell you that I spoke with senior Israelis connected to the government in the weeks leading up to this decision, where they're very worried this was going to happen. And their basic view is, at this point, Iran's presence in Syria is a more important issue than the Iranian nuclear program. In a way, if they got everything they wanted, this is the Netanyahu government, in terms of constraints on Iran's nuclear program, if it did not include some solution to the presence of Iran in Syria and the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah and Lebanon, they wouldn't want it. That shows you just how central this is to the strategic thinking of the current Israeli government. And so when Trump comes along and says, essentially, the Iranian issue in Syria is none of our concern, that gravely disturbs an Israeli government that looks to Trump as being sort of their ultimate champion. So I think that they are scrambling to figure out what to do about this. And it was interesting that Bolton made a very quick stop in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv to say, hey, we're going to work this out in a way that's consistent with your interest. But I have not had the chance just in the last month or so to talk to anyone senior in the Israeli government.
So you've given us an iota of hope about Iran against the backdrop of a lot of bad news. I'm curious if you'd handicap the likelihood that we'll have a conflict with them in the next 2 years.
Look, I think we should not underestimate what it means for the National Security Advisor of the United States to task the Pentagon to come up with military strike options against Iran. That is not some idle thing. That's a real thing. And John Bolton is a very canny inside player in D.C. He knows how to manipulate the process. And even if President Trump wants no part of any war with anyone in the Middle East, there are things that just kind of click into motion that can raise the prospects that it happens. So I do not regard it as a likelihood, but I regard it as definitely in the realm of possibility. Not a trivial possibility either. It is something that could easily be set off by any number of things happening in Syria, in the Gulf, in Iraq, elsewhere, and we could then be off to the races.
Yeah. So there are a million other issues to get to, and maybe we can get to some of them in the Q&A. We were talking earlier today about China. Just cover a few more foreign policy and domestic policy issues. Our relationship with China is unrecognizable with the one we had 3 years ago. I guess the question is, are the forces that have been released, can those demons be put back in the bottle? Is there a chance to get I don't know that we'll ever get back to a responsible stakeholder sort of model of how we'd like to see China rise, but it really does seem like we've driven the car over the edge on this one.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. So basically what's happened is Republicans and Democrats, policymakers and politicians alike, have essentially all concluded in the last 3 years, very, very rapidly and very recently, we totally screwed up. We got China all wrong. We had these bets that if we integrated them into the world economy, they'd become more politically liberal over time, that if we brought them into our rules-based order, that they would become a responsible stakeholder, as you said, and that their interest in stability would lead them to act in less aggressive ways. And these bets didn't pay off, and now they're big and powerful, and they took advantage of us, and we have a closing window of opportunity to do something about it. So by golly, we got to do something. And it's no longer about cooperation. Now it's about competition. And competition, in a way, is kind of a code word for confrontation. That, I think, is like essentially where the body language of the Democratic and Republican national security establishment is right now. And I think there has been a useful corrective from this view that China would just conform to a Western-style system, either domestically or in terms of it just kind of buying in lock, stock, and barrel to the international order. But I think that corrective has gone way overboard. I don't believe that we are destined for a new Cold War with China. I think we can find a way to have a set of understandings between the United States and China that does not remove every element of competition from the relationship, but doesn't make the whole relationship about competition. And so my view would be that the first thing we need to do is define where are we trying to get. What is a world in which the US and China can effectively coexist in their mutual common interest and in the interest of everybody else? Because the thing about a Cold War is when George Kennan wrote the long telegram, and by the way, George Kennan was the first director of policy planning, a job I subsequently held, and based on that, you can see the secular decline in the quality of policy planning directors from the first one till now. When he wrote the long telegram and he wrote his foreign affairs piece, his entire argument about containing the Soviet Union was premised on the observation that the Soviet Union was bound one day to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Okay? So what do? You contain them until they collapse. I don't think we should root for, nor should we expect China's collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. It has plenty of challenges, and it's going to hit walls and stumble and so forth in the years ahead. But we're not hoping for a country of 1.4 billion people to just implode the way the Soviet Union did. That would not be in our interest in the interconnected world we live in today. Nor, even if we wanted it, should we expect it to happen. So you can't build a strategy the way that we did in the Cold War vis-a-vis China. You have to expect it is going to be a confident, self-assured, large actor on the world stage and ask yourself, okay, so what are the parameters of that relationship? And from there then, I think you try to build an effective pathway to get from where we are now to there. And of course, again, it takes two to tango. But I find myself in this weird position where when I came into the administration, I felt I was a bit more hawkish on China. Now I feel like the ultimate dove on China because I'm like, whoa, what happened? Yeah. I woke up one day and the center of gravity had shifted so dramatically. But there is no more important issue in American foreign policy. There is no important relationship in the world than the one between the US and China. And if we don't get this right, we're all going to be in for it.
Well, it's also hard to imagine what a confrontation would look like when just the cutoff of trading or a sharp diminution in trading, set aside the tariffs, would be disastrous for both of our economies. And as it is, we may face some kind of economic hiccups or worse from because of the Chinese economic problems. Yeah. I mean, we really are in a situation now where we hang together, we hang separately.
Well, it's interesting you say that because since 1972, until very recently, the relationship between the US and China was basically defined by increasing engagement at every level. Increasing political engagement, military to military engagement, student to student engagement, people to people, economic, et cetera. Now we're moving in the other direction on almost every single one of those fronts, towards more disengagement. And one of the areas where that's especially true that is kind of vexing is the increasing talk about decoupling the technology industry in the United States from the technology industry in China, that we essentially are going to make the world choose between American tech and Chinese tech. What is motivating this is a very legitimate concern about Chinese practices, including the outright wholesale theft of American intellectual property. But there is no serious conversation happening right now between Washington and Silicon Valley about what this means, whether this is good, how this would work. And we're talking about everything from AI to biotechnology to quantum computing on down the line. And I feel very passionately that we have got to get a real dialogue happening between technologists and policymakers in America about where we want this to go, because this is happening as we speak. And it's a trend that is worth everybody watching.
So let's step back from the countries and the continents and look inward. It's been said that the greatest impediment right now to successful American foreign policy is our own polarization. And I'm curious, first of all, whether you agree with that, and second of all, how you see us getting over that, since I know you believe that the United States has to play an important leadership role in the world and that we still can. So, we've got two parts of the puzzle. How do we make it all square?
Yeah. Look, if I had the answer to this, I'd like bottle it and sell it and, go public with an IPO or something. I'd say a couple things. First, my natural instinct, I grew up in Minnesota, is a kind of you got to get along mentality. So it's been interesting moving to New Hampshire, where the state motto is live free or die. Because like in Minnesota, it'd be more like live free or else, just accommodate or whatever. Like die, that seems crazy and really aggressive. So, my natural instinct is to think a la Obama, a la people like Beto O'Rourke. There is a kind of way for politics to become a unifying rather than divisive force, but the evidence is very much to the contrary in recent years. And so I don't think there is a silver bullet on this, but I do believe fundamentally that when you look at the Democratic primary in 2020, I think there's such a hunger for voices that are more about healing and unity than about just going to the ramparts, which is kind of contrary to what you read in the political conventional wisdom, which is it's going to be the people who are going to be toughest on Trump who will end up doing the best. I actually think it is going to be the political formula for success in 2020, because the antibodies in our country against this kind of division and fracture are quite strong, will be much more towards someone who is trying to reach out, who is trying to understand their political opponents. But at the maximum, in my view, you're talking about going from a 60-40 situation to like a 70-30 situation. I mean, I think there's always going to be a hardcore in the United States that has a fundamentally different view of what this country is all about. And so we shouldn't try to overreach for what we're going for.
So what you're suggesting is that America as a country is mostly Minnesotans under the skin. Is that right?
Mostly, a majority. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's talk about that Democratic field. Right now it looks like they're going to be running all three of the Triple Crown races at once, with like 25, 30 candidates galloping hither and yon in our own backyard. How do you group them, break them down? Where do you see as the key lines of fracture, the axes of differences among them?
Look, I think the three biggest debates that are going to happen within the Democratic primary field are the one I just mentioned, which is, do you win by really firing people up by being deeply anti-Trump, or do you win by trying to pull people together? And that goes for everything from messaging to your actual strategy of who you're trying to get to the polls and vote. And that will be a real debate. You'll have candidates on both sides of that debate. The second is going to be a debate between whether this is the moment to really go for broke with maximalist progressive priorities, or to try to capture a larger swath of the electorate with things that will look definitely more progressive than we've ever seen before, because the center of gravity in the party has shifted, but trimming the sails a bit to try to capture a larger vote share. And that will be an intense debate. It was a debate that played out to a certain extent in 2018, particularly among candidates in districts that had been Republican for a very long time. And then the third is going to be between experience and safety and known quantities and, oh my gosh, we just need somebody we can trust who can beat Trump and get in there, which will be a powerful undercurrent in the primary, and someone new and fresh who's looking to the future. And Democrats have tended in these open primaries to look to, particularly in terms of the standard bearers who go on to win, like a Clinton, Obama, Kennedy, to a younger generation. But this isn't a year where actually an argument that says you can count on me and you can put, my safe hands can carry the day is particularly compelling given just the state of disarray and disorder that so many people find the American political world in now. So those would be the main axes that I think things will break down on. And yeah, I think it's impossible to predict right now how those debates shake out, let alone who actually emerges at the end of the day as the nominee.
You touched on this, but I want to press you a little on it. I think a lot of us have been sitting around and thinking, especially those of us who are in government, going back to the Clinton era when we were trying to figure out how to say that globalization can be good for you, how we wrap our arms around the inequality issue. Globalization and inequality have gone hand in hand. And I'm curious how you think that debate is going to shape up in the campaign, because it does seem like we've gotten to a point of inflection, and the kind of remarkable response to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's, anyway, her suggestion that we move to 70% taxation on the highest earners. That seemed to have been a catalytic moment. So I would imagine that this is going to be a huge deal in the primaries, and I'm curious where you think we come out.
So I think the relationship between the government and the free market, which is kind of the core issue of how you address things as fundamental as income inequality, we are in a moment of profound transition right now. So Ronald Reagan comes in 1980 on a tide which says the government is bad, the market is good, it's as simple as that. And that tide ultimately sweeps over both parties, so that by 1996, Bill Clinton is saying in his inaugural address, the era of big government is over. In a way, that tide continued all the way through the Obama administration. Obama was to the left of Clinton, but a fundamental heir to a logic around both a political and a policy logic that was much more moderate in its orientation. I think what happened post-financial crisis, which revealed these longer-term underlying structural trends in a delayed way, was that the center of gravity in the country, not just among Democrats, but among independents as well, to be open to bigger, bolder solutions to address the problem of inequality and other structural imbalances in our country. The window opened on that to a much more significant extent. So just as an example, so single payer now is where the debate revolves around, and you relate to single payer in some way, which 5 years ago one would have never thought. 70% top marginal rate, moderate Democrats would say to that, not, oh, the horror. They would say, well, actually, the most wealthy people in America don't earn their money from income, they earn their money from wealth, and so actually a top marginal rate of 70% isn't going to get at the core of the problem because it's not doing enough, in a way, to tax where the money actually is. So, like, that's strange that this is the new field on which we're playing. And a lot of people say, well, the Democrats are going to screw themselves over by going left. Why are they going left? And my basic view, and looking at a lot of polling data, is that in a way the center of gravity in the country has moved left. The country has said, we want to redefine this relationship between the government and the market. We want not the return to the New Deal as it was, but to that kind of thinking, big, ambitious solutions to the problems that we face, tailored to the economy that we exist in today. So it's not just going to be a big public works program, it's going to have to be something that deals with the on-demand economy. It's going to have to be something that deals with corporate concentration that is at its highest levels since before we had robust antitrust rules. It's going to have to deal with a whole series of new issues. But I don't think that's a bad thing, and I also don't think it's a political loser. And I think that's going to run as a current through everyone in the Democratic primary. So even the people who are called kind of conservatives or neoliberal shills or whatever are going to be much more progressive in their orientation than your standard fare Democratic candidate from a decade ago. Many people have remarked about the shift on things like gay marriage or criminal justice reform or other social issues. But this shift on economic issues is real, it's profound, I think it's here to stay. And by the way, Donald Trump has made this shift for the Republican base as well. When he ran, he's handed the government over to Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan over the last 2 years. But think about his campaign platform. It was raising taxes on the wealthy, Glass-Steagall, protecting Social Security and Medicare, $1 trillion investment program, things Republicans would never say, but that Donald Trump said, and didn't hurt him with the Republican base. They all said, yeah, give me some more of that. So I think this is a very live factor in how we're going to be approaching the big questions of economic policy in the years ahead. Politics and gridlock on Capitol Hill may disrupt it, but the energy, the tide, I think, is very much going in that direction and will for many years to come.
Okay, well, on a rising tide, let's open it up to the audience. How about some questions? Let's start right here. Please wait for the microphone. Otherwise, posterity will not know what you said. Right down here.
Thank you for talking.
Is it on?
Oh, there.
There we go.
Thank you for coming today. So looking forward to 2020, how much of an appetite do you think there is among Democrats and independents for a candidate that espouses kind of a classic American deep engagement strategy and more abstractly like a revamped vision of American exceptionalism, or is the appetite going to be more for kind of a progressive version of the Trumpian isolationist leaning policy?
I don't know the answer to that question yet, to be honest with you. I think that's really up for grabs. I don't think anyone who tells you confidently it's one way or the other, I don't think is looking at the actual available evidence, which is pretty mixed. Americans are deeply ambivalent. One thing that I think has happened is that what might have been a civil war within the Democratic Party over, say, deep engagement versus a kind of neo-isolationism, is Trump has essentially put anything like that civil war on hold and pulled people together around some basic principles that lean more towards American engagement in the world. Allies, values, institutions, global problem solving around big issues like climate change, nuclear proliferation, global health, what have you. And so if you read Bernie Sanders' speeches of late or Elizabeth Warren's Foreign Affairs article, they don't lay out a traditional form of deep engagement as we've understood it, but they are fundamentally internationalist in their orientation, including, by the way, in scoping the world as including some big threats. Geopolitical threats from Russia and China, threats from transnational forces like pandemics and weapons of mass destruction and the like. So I believe that there is space and scope for a candidate to come forward and say that the great challenges of our time cannot be solved by any one country acting alone, and probably cannot be effectively solved sustainably without the United States playing an important role in it. And so let's get to work. And I think that will be an argument that people buy into. The piece that I think will have to somehow be modified in the traditional account of deep engagement is the particular role of the US military, especially in the Middle East. And there I think what an effective candidate will essentially say, there is nothing inconsistent with a broadly engaged America that is helping lead the world to solve the great problems of our time, and a view that says we need to be winding down these forever wars. Someone's got to be able to put those two pieces together. And there are forces and voices in Washington who are going to want to say, as soon as you start saying pull out of Afghanistan, you're now in the isolationist bucket. I think we need to collectively resist that as a party and find a way to define a future for American internationalism, for a unique and compelling leadership role for America in the world, which I believe can and should continue even in a more multipolar environment, that solves for some of these legacy issues around the over-reliance on U.S. military force in certain parts of the world.
So you opened the door to this one, Counselor. Afghanistan. everyone, I think, is moving towards the yes, we should. It's 17 plus years. It's time to get out. There's another side to the argument, which is there's no example on Earth, I believe, where in history where longevity has increased as much as it has in Afghanistan in the time we've been involved, where the number of women and girls who have had an opportunity to get education has increased as rapidly as it has, an issue very dear to the heart of someone we both used to work for. And where the quality of life has really improved for so many people over this period of time. And in addition, there's a security imperative not to have another failed country where terrorists can plot and launch attacks from. I understand the politics of it all. I'm not sure I understand the strategy of it all.
Well, if you were sitting around, well, there's two ways of looking at this. One is we've made certain commitments there, and I think to large numbers of people, real human beings, and we need to work to fulfill those commitments, similar to what I said about the courage. You can't just walk out tomorrow and say, to heck with these Afghans, doesn't matter. We've built relationships, and we have built up reliance interests, and that has to count for something. On the other hand, a kid born today, a kid born after we started the war in Afghanistan could, in certain circumstances, serve in the war in Afghanistan today. That's how long it's been going on. It's the longest American military engagement that we've ever had. And for people who say, well, it's not that big, it's 10,000 troops, maybe 12,000, whatever the number is, it is a significant number of troops who are still in harm's way, still being killed, and it's $45 billion a year that we are not spending, not just on guns versus butter, but on any number of other strategic priorities, including, by the way, reducing the threat of terrorism to the United States homeland in a more systematic and priority-based way. So my basic view is that we need to put a pathway to say what you just laid out cannot be an argument for a permanent commitment of $45 billion and 10,000 troops and the like in Afghanistan. So let's get a pathway and let's finally get it done. Because as one general put it, we haven't fought a 17-year war in Afghanistan. We fought 17 one-year wars in which every year we say we're turning the corner. And I thought Elizabeth Warren actually had a nice phrase. She said, we've turned the corner so many times we're going in circles. And I think that's kind of true in Afghanistan. And for those who say, well, let's just take it down to maybe a more sustainable force, we'll stay there at like 2,000, 3,000, the simple fact is that our military will tell you that you can't go below a certain number without going to zero because you need all the force protection and other elements attached to it. So it's sort of like buy in for a really substantial investment, meaningful investment, indefinitely, or come up with a pathway out and stick to that pathway. And for those who say, well, that's just telling our enemies we're leaving, I gotta tell you, at some point, after so many years, we have to ask ourselves whether the connection between America's military presence and our diplomatic leverage with the Taliban is really as tight as we've suggested all these years, because it hasn't produced meaningful progress on the battlefield. I mean, at the bargaining table.
Okay, I see a lot of people who want to hear me talk less. Okay, why don't we go right over here?
Hi, thanks for coming.
Wait, can you wait for the mic?
Thank you for coming. You mentioned earlier that America should look for a way forward that's not merely nostalgic. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that, an aversion to nostalgia in policy might look like.
So I'd say a couple things. First, especially after someone like Trump comes into power, the natural thing is to say, let's just get back to the way we were doing things before because this is a lot worse. But I think that glosses over what was already a reckoning that had to come on some significant issues. Number one is what I described before, the rise of China. How does the United States build a sustainable relationship with China that does not just presume they are going to buy into our system entirely, or that the only alternative is a Cold War? So big pillar for me, maybe the defining pillar of how everything else plays out. The second thing is that technology in so many different ways is putting pressure both on our societies and on the international system as a whole. Our political system has been completely transformed and in some ways warped and disrupted by technology. Our economy, very much so, and it will be even more as the advent of AI comes. So how are we going to work to build collective responses to that serve the interest of our people? And for the United States, I would say a central feature of that has got to be to stop thinking about foreign policy as distinct from domestic policy. These two fields are going to have to merge. When we sat around the Situation Room table in the Obama administration, we just didn't often enough ask the question, the paramount question, what does this mean for the strength and health of the American middle class, this thing we're doing anywhere else in the world? And we have to start doing that to a greater extent. And then the final thing that I think has to be a part of this kind of reckoning, I mean, there are many others, but the final I'll mention now is, in my view, we know how to use the military tool very effectively, not always to good effect, not always to winning wars, but like we know how to use it. We know how to mobilize, we know how to plan, we know how to resource. We know how to use the sanctions tool very effectively. But we tend to rely on those two at the expense of actually really investing in a kind of modern notion of what diplomacy would look like. And diplomacy is so badly called for. Good old-fashioned American problem-solving diplomacy at a time when these really significant issues, from migration to pandemics to the technological issues I just described, to solving for the potential of another global financial crisis, require us to come up with more nimble, flexible, adaptable ways of diplomatically solving big problems. That is going to require a revolution in our thinking. I'm still young, I think, although when I teach, I realize that that's probably not the case. And yet, even I'm kind of like part of the old guard in a way. That what we need is people like you, young folks who have not already had certain assumptions and priors baked in, to say, what's our approach to these things going to be? How are we going to take on these big challenges? And I think it's up to us to lift up and elevate new voices, to expand the conversation beyond who's typically been around the table. And that's what I would like to be a part of doing in the years ahead.
We'll go right here.
Yeah, I had the great privilege of being a Peace Corps country director in a number of countries that were hotspots, including Ukraine, and I was in West Africa for Ebola. And I really became so appreciative of the State Department as a member of the country team. And I think just a comment, I think the State Department needs to do a better job of marketing itself to the American public. Of what, I don't think people really have an idea of what State Department really does. So that's just a comment. But I'd like to ask a question about Mr. Putin. It seems like, you know, I was there during the Maidan Revolution. I was there when he invaded Ukraine. I had Peace Corps volunteers in those areas, although they were gone by the time he got there. We'd evacuated. But it seems like what he needs is somebody to just stand up to him. You know, and that's kind of what he looks at. And I wonder if there was a big mistake made by President Obama in Syria when he had really drawn the line in the sand about the chemical weapons, and then he backed off, and that Putin saw that as weakness, and that had a big impact on what happened in Syria. Not to say the options were all that great for us, but I'd be interested in your view on standing up to Putin and what happened in Syria and what might have happened differently if we had taken a different stance at that time.
You know, it's interesting. I've heard many times the argument that Obama's decision in Syria had a big impact on Putin's calculus in Ukraine because he felt, oh, I've taken the measure of the man and it's a weak American president and I can go in. I disagreed with how President Obama approached the issue of the Syria red line, but I think it is a bridge too far to really draw this connection for the following reason. That George W. Bush had no trouble using force in the Middle East, in Iraq, in the period from 2003 to 2008. And yet that had no real impact or bearing on the Russians deciding, and not even Putin, Medvedev deciding to invade Georgia. So the resoluteness of an American president to use military force in the Middle East weighing on the Russian president's calculation for how to deal with a piece of territory on their border that they really feel is kind of fundamental to their security interests, I'm pretty skeptical of that connection, to be honest with you. But your broader question about whether it's just got to be about strength, in some ways I'm kind of attracted to it, that, you know, you got to show toughness in order to then get to the table to be able to talk things through. But in another sense, I worry about how that actually gets executed in practice. Because as I was saying before, like we somehow have got to find a way to show Putin that we're serious about a set of consequences if he chooses to go one route, but also not kind of pick at the scabs that have built up from him about disrespect and everything else. On the other hand, because otherwise all that standing up is just going to create these kinds of self-fulfilling prophecies where we head down a bad road. So look, I don't have the answer exactly. I just have an intuition which says there's a way to deal with this guy with a stiff backbone and clear eyes and looking him in the eye, but that doesn't kind of say the first thing we need to do is the following 5 punitive acts and then he'll see who's boss. Because I'm just not, it doesn't strike me that that kind of approach, given the psychological makeup of the man, is likely to be successful.
Right here. Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. I was wondering if you could give us your take on the relationship between the United States and Brazil now that Bolsonaro got elected.
So I was National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden at a time when he was building a relationship with Dilma Rousseff, one of the previous presidents, who ultimately left under, you know, obviously a very dark cloud. And what has struck me over the years is for a country that is as significant an actor in Latin America, beyond just South America, for a country of its size, its ambition, its capacity, the United States and Brazil have an unbelievably immature relationship. Immature, I don't mean immature in the sense of like teenager-like. I mean just like it's not deep. The relationships aren't deep, the expertise isn't deep, the interchange isn't deep, the understanding of each other's countries and perspectives isn't deep. And so it skates along at this very surface level. We have surface dialogues, very little in the way of any kind of true joint initiatives, even though we have so many common interests. And so that makes it susceptible to this kind of like, you know, you'd get the relationship with the leader, then it kind of goes up in flames because of the nature of politics in Brazil. And I think that's kind of where we are now with this relationship. It'll be a relationship between Donald Trump and Bolsonaro, maybe Mike Pence and Bolsonaro, and not much else, in a way. And so I think we have a fundamental task ahead of us in the U.S.-Brazil relationship to really dive into it and think about why it's perhaps one of the most underperforming significant relationships that the United States has in the world.
Let me go right over here.
Thank you for speaking today. I wanted to ask about kind of how you see U.S.-Iran relations evolving, given that they evolve in a practical, reasoned manner. Given their kind of increased leverage in Syria and to some extent Iraq and Yemen as well, and at the same time their kind of crumbling economy, which we've seen very recently, how do you foresee kind of moving back to the relationship that we saw maybe 3-4 years ago with kind of the JCPOA held in high regards and the return of assets? Do you think that kind of same relationship will be able to exist in the future? And if not, what kind of different steps will we need to take to kind of reduce the intensity of the situation?
I mean, the fundamental story of the Iran nuclear deal, which I did a lot of work on, is one of each side having some leverage that essentially they traded off against each other and produced an outcome. The U.S. and the international community had the sanctions. Iran had a whole bunch of nuclear capacity it could give away, a stockpile, centrifuges, a heavy water reactor, and the like. Well, Iran's given all that away. So now Iran doesn't have a whole lot of leverage in the space of, the nuclear file. So they have two choices, because from their perspective, they're getting hit hard and they've got no leverage, so they're kind of stuck. They've got two basic ways. I guess they have three choices. Build leverage by going back to building nuclear capacity, that is leaving the JCPOA, and there are serious voices in Iran talking about doing just that. The phrase they use is less for less, that if we're getting only 20% of the benefits of the JCPOA because the US has reimposed sanctions, we're only going to do 20% of the things we said we're going to do, which means more centrifuges, more heavy water, more stockpile, et cetera. The downside of that option is they start going down that road, and all of the goodwill they've cultivated with Europe and others is going to evaporate fairly quickly, and the John Boltons of the world are going to argue, let's do something. Second option is to build leverage by challenging the United States more frontally and directly in the places you described. Iraq, probably most centrally. The problem with that approach, which was a strategy they deployed through much of the 2000s by arming and training the Iraqi Shia militias that attacked and killed a lot of US service members in Iraq. They go down that road, and they are potentially picking a fight for a direct military confrontation with the United States. So far, they have chosen not to do that. The third option is to grin and bear it and wait it out for 2021 and follow Real Clear Politics polling averages on the website and just hope that Donald Trump doesn't get elected president. And then a Democrat's going to come in, and they'll just go back to the JCPOA, and everything will be fine. That is the current mentality of the government in Iran from my perspective. That's what they want to have happen, and that's what they're hoping will happen. But I think the problem with that strategy is a Democrat who is elected in 2021 cannot simply go immediately back to the JCPOA as it was, that we will be too many years down the line and too close to some of the transition dates within the agreement that there's going to have to be some conversation about what we do in the years ahead. I mean, fundamentally, a Democrat's going to want to embrace the Iran deal and get back to it, but given the passage of time and everything else, there will have to be a conversation about what the parameters of that are, and the Iranians will have to accept that. So the real question is, can they succeed in the grin and bear it strategy, or are they going to have to look for one of these other points of leverage, and does that come accompanied with them being willing to actually sit down and negotiate with the Trump administration? Because Trump desperately wants to talk to these guys. Trump called the Iran nuclear deal the worst agreement in human history, and as someone who was president at the creation of negotiating it, if that's true, that is an incredibly impressive achievement. Because there have been a lot of deals in human history, and if this is the worst one ever, like, you should get some kind of award for that. But I believe that if it was not called the JCPOA, but rather the TCPOA, the Trump guy, he'd take it. I mean, the deal he's negotiating with Kim Jong-un is far less intrusive and tight than this deal. He'd take it in a heartbeat. He'd love to negotiate with these guys. But the politics in Iran right now probably don't allow for it, although if they decided they were going one of these leverage routes, they might open up a diplomatic channel. So that's the best I can assess about where things are with Iran right now.
It also might cause his own administration to melt down.
Well, that's true. Yes, you have Pompeo and Bolton, who are passionate Iran hardliner hawks, probably regime changers, who will do everything they can from within to sabotage that. Yeah.
I'm curious, jumping around, do you expect a challenge to Trump from within his own party?
I'm sure someone will file for the nomination in the Republican Party. I do not believe that it will end up being a serious challenge. One of the interesting things about looking at the polling data on the shutdown is there's this series of polls which show Democrats, Trump's blamed in kind of the mid-50s, Democrats are blamed in sort of the low 30s. But if you look in the numbers, 88 to 90% of Republicans are with Trump on this. Okay.
Yeah.
If that remains the case, there is going to be no effective challenge to Donald Trump in going into 2020. And I've heard people say he's not going to run. He'll just leave. I got to tell you, as somebody who watched the rise of Donald Trump conceitedly in the early months with some skepticism, I have the zealot of a convert that we should not underestimate this guy, both his willingness to endure a whole lot of pain and inflict a lot of pain through the political process, and his desire to be reelected, and frankly, the legitimate chance that he could be.
Well, he also has a lot of legal reasons to want to be reelected.
Well, true, yeah.
Okay. Sam.
Thank you. So I have a question more about executive power, specifically the power of the vice presidency. So your article in The Atlantic was titled "What Trump and Dick Cheney Got Wrong About American Exceptionalism." Obviously, Vice just came out about Dick Cheney. So a two-part question. The first, why the sudden renewed focus on Cheney? And the second, having served as National Security Advisor for Biden, can you talk a little bit about the role of vice president? Is it merely symbolic, or has that changed in the last few years in foreign policy?
It's a great question. On the first question, my focus on Cheney was largely because he was an avatar for a particular brand of American exceptionalism that I thought had kind of polluted the idea in really unhelpful ways. He wrote a book with his daughter Liz called Exceptional America, in which it really is, he uses phrases like America's unmatched goodness and greatness, kind of stuff that's just a little ridiculous. And I think it's like he hijacked some important concepts and gave them a bad name, and I want to be part of the effort to take them back. So that's why I did this tie-in with the movie. I got them to put that out at the same time just to boost readership of my article. No, I haven't seen the movie. I hear it's a little bit insane, but I have not seen it. In terms of the power of the vice president, constitutionally, they have virtually no responsibility other than breaking ties in the Senate and having a heartbeat. But if you have the kind of relationship that Barack Obama and Joe Biden had, then they play two absolutely critical roles. One is as kind of central confidant and advisor in the close circle of people making all of the hard decisions of foreign policy over the 8 years, and nobody was a voice to Barack Obama on foreign policy more than Joe Biden over those 8 years. And as National Security Advisor to the Vice President, I was part of the core team of President Obama who met every day in the Oval Office for the President's daily briefing. My successor, Tony Blinken, my predecessor, Tony Blinken, my successor, Colin Kahl, same thing. So that was an incredibly empowered opportunity for the Vice President and his team to play a central role in the decision-making process. And then the other aspect is taking on important diplomatic responsibilities. Joe Biden's relationship with Petro Poroshenko in the Ukraine crisis, his relationships with Santos and others in Latin America around the Colombia peace process, his work on Iraq, particularly with Masoud Barzani, the relationship that he built with Abadi when he came into office. This was a force multiplier for two active secretaries of state, Clinton and Kerry, who had more than they could say grace over, to have someone like Biden who had the relationships to be able to do that. That's not true of every vice president, but it's been interesting to watch Mike Pence take the previous vice president's focus on Latin America as a main area and pick that up and run with it. Sort of he saw a lane for himself there. So every vice president is different, but if you have the right kind of relationship between number one and number two, it can be an incredibly empowered and effective role, and I think that's exactly the kind of role that Joe Biden played.
Okay, well, we still got lots of students, questions. You on the far left. We're going to the far left now. You, yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming to talk today. I have a comment before my question, which is with the discussion of unity and desire for a unifier in the Democratic Party. It sounds like you're endorsing your home state senator, Amy Klobuchar. Anyway, my question...
You'll be allowed to comment on that, Jake.
Yeah. My question is on the role of the media in particular in the past couple of years and in the Trump presidency. How do you think the news media, cable news, newspapers have handled the sort of deluge of information and news coming out of the administration and the Trump presidency? Do you think that there are issues that aren't getting enough focus that should be? Do you think that things are being sensationalized that shouldn't be? Where's your head on that?
So a couple thoughts. First of all, I love Amy Klobuchar. I used to work for her. She has a legitimate claim to both run and to make a case for being the Democratic nominee, just like many others do, including other former bosses of mine. So I will refrain from endorsing anybody, since I have more than one person that I've worked for who may end up seeking the nomination. But I do think Amy, one thing I will say about Amy is, if you look at a map of Minnesota in 2018, she ran for re-election, and most of these maps in these purple states, it's like a blue dot where there are cities, and then the rest of the state is just red. And even if you win, right, it's like because you overwhelmed in the city and kind of compensated. Minnesota's pretty blue, you know. I mean, there's red pockets, but a lot of blue throughout. She's capable of talking to not just urban and suburban voters, but ex-urban and rural voters as well, and has a special talent at that. But other candidates do as well. You know, I was just talking about my former boss, Joe Biden, who, you know, will bring that appeal with him as well. On the news media, one thing that I will say that I found fascinating is the news media has basically had one tool to hold politicians accountable, and that is shame. And it has been very effective for them, and there's almost like a rhythm to it. Something happens, you go shame the person into either apologizing or resigning or taking it back or modifying. And they have tried to apply this tool repeatedly to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump doesn't have any shame. And so it's been utterly ineffective, and they have not figured out an alternative. And so rather than figure out some other mechanism, they've just raised the volume of their voice in ways that I don't think are particularly helpful. So that you get, you know, democracy dies in darkness is to me like almost a kind of shout about stuff. It's not, leave aside what's happening on cable news, which is extreme. I think this kind of sense of moral outrage at the newspapers, I understand it, I feel moral outrage, but for papers to be taking on this kind of mentality, and reporters to, I think does actually degrade the quality of political discourse in the country. That's not even to mention what's happening on the right, which is just a damn shame. I mean, Fox News is basically state-run television. I would always argue, especially as a policy guy and a guy who worked on policy shops and campaigns, that we should cover policy more than the horse race. But it's not actually news media that is making that decision, it's people. They read the horse race stories and they don't read the policy stories. So I don't know quite how to solve for that problem, but we're gonna just have another round of that with 15 Democratic candidates. It's all gonna be about who has the best Instagram feed or whatever, and not as much about the policy debate as I would like it to be. And my only hope is that the demand signal from voters and a unique role for places like Iowa and New Hampshire, where people do try to dig in deeper, will place some discipline on that, but I don't hold out a lot of hope for it.
So we are getting to the witching hour, and I thought that I would just suggest that in closing, you wrote this fabulous article about American exceptionalism revisited, and I'm sure some people in the room have read it, but I was wondering if you just want to give a précis of it as a thought about where you think we should be headed in foreign policy.
Yeah, so just very briefly, because I've talked to you guys a lot and threaded some of these ideas through my comments. The jumping off point for the article was basically that I grew up in the 1980s and kind of came of age with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the emergence of America from the Cold War, feeling confident and proud, and that's like where my foreign policy tradition comes from. And I look at both a lot of younger people today, but also the political debate around how America's just gotten screwed in the world all this time, and I started asking myself, where did this whole debate go so far off track? And my basic argument is that this idea that the United States has unique capabilities and attributes that it can use to contribute not just to our own national interest, but to the global common interest, is an incredibly important idea right now, especially because we're being offered a false choice between nationalism and globalism. And I think an idea like American exceptionalism, redefined in a way that isn't about us being better, isn't about America love it or leave it, but it's about America warts and all, about the fact that we do have flaws and failures, massive failures, but we also have these attributes and assets that no other significant power today or really in history has been able to bring to the table, and we should grab those, be proud of those, and put those to use. And the article lays out essentially my case for both why that is so and then how we would put them to use. And for those of you who haven't read it, I recommend it, and whether you agree with it or not, it's worth your time if you have a spare few minutes.
It's a great article, and it's been a great conversation. So thank you very much, Jake. And we look forward to more conversation.